day 2 of our workshop on the promise of genome editing tools to advance environmental health research. I'm Gary Miller. I'm part of the organizing committee. And I just wanted to provide a little bit of an introduction to today and a recap of yesterday. So I'm looking for how to advance because I don't see the thing even up here. There it is. So this is actually the tail end of yesterday's session 2. So I think this sums up nicely a lot of the things we talked about yesterday. Was in our materials, there was a quote from Wenzu in Nature was, "I wish I had this technology sooner. My postdoc would have been a lot shorter." And I think this is a lot of the thinking is that when you have these sorts of enabling technologies, it allows you to do things faster and in a more thorough way. But I think that this isn't always the case. And I'll give you an example of just sort of like a genetic challenge, not even in a CRISPR thing, but give an example. So my lab had done some work on a gene SV2C that had very little known about it. And I applied for an R21 grant to look at some of these effects we had seen in reward seeking. It was an R21. And the review, we'd made the knockout mouse and had done a lot of characterization. And the reviewer said, well, this is great, but you need to make Cre-Lox lines so you have tissue specific and neuron specific. They asked me to make about 6 different lines of mice. And it was kind of hard to argue because yeah, these are really elegant experiments. You would be able to have the expression you wanted in the right places that would allow you to answer these questions. But it was an R21, right? The idea is that when you have these new technologies, it becomes the new standard. The bar becomes raised, and now everyone expects you to do that. And I think this is quite a challenge because as the CRISPR technologies and other gene editing technologies advance, it will become the expectation. So postdocs will not be shorter because we have these technologies. It's just the bar will keep being raised. And I think that's an important thing to consider is that it's going to allow us to ask bigger questions and answer them more thoroughly. It's not advancing.
Push hard.
I was pushing hard. I did it the first time. Can you advance from back there? I know. Okay. So just to kind of start with a few questions, the first one is that, is environmental health research special? In this context is that, are we asking questions that pose certain challenges to the use of genome editing? And this is a really critical point because if the way we're using gene editing is the same that's being used in every other field, we don't have to worry about all these sort of special issues when you're looking at the effect of a toxicant or a chemical. If we do think there's some nuances to it, do we need NIEHS to provide guidance to grantees on how they should be approaching these problems? Or do we just think that study sections are the appropriate arbiter to say if these things are being done correctly? And I think we alluded to this yesterday is that, if we were trying to encourage the use of these gene editing technologies, are our study sections appropriately staffed to review them? Because when we see this often in environmental health and toxicology is that if you bring in a bunch of experts in a technology and they have no background in the issues we face with dose response and various things, you'll have all these experts expecting to use the latest technology on gene editing, but not understanding our problems. And so it's something where we have to be cautious about thinking the study sections will do it because as we saw from this meeting, it's just beginning to become adopted by investigators in this area, and so it's going to pose a pretty significant challenge. So we also talked about this a bit yesterday about the reagent sharing. So I think this is something we've seen. There's great examples of how quickly, after papers come out, the things are available on Adgene, the tools and technologies are there. But it reminds me of, on our grants, how we have this, sharing statement that we've spent all this time saying how we're going to do all these great things and share all these tools, but it's never enforced and it's never checked upon. And it's something like, do we do this correctly? Are we really having this done the right way? And as we discussed yesterday, it's a good thing to discuss is that should NIEHS or should NIH or should other industry partners help facilitate the sharing of these materials to really make sure that it is easy for investigators to get their hands on these things. I mean, I think this is one of the great things about the technology. We haven't talked that much about it, but this idea of the expense is that you're not asking someone to have to buy a $50,000 or $100,000 piece of equipment, is that the use and application of CRISPR is within your supply budget for the most part, at least from the idea of getting the reagents. And so it's something where it's not as difficult to expect someone to do these experiments, but we want to make sure that they have access to the right tools and the right controls to make sure the work is done correctly. So one thing I thought would be good for us to be thinking about today, we're not going to actually do this as an exercise, but just thinking about this as we go through the rest of the day, is that if you were a program officer for the day and they said, we want to do an RFA, we're considering doing something on genome editing, what would it look like? Are we past this sort of Brenner technique stage? Is the technique far enough along that we don't need any more development, at least as it applies to environmental health, and we're ready to go to that discovery phase? What are the high impact areas ripe for discovery? If you're going to do an RFA, NIHS wants to use their money in the most economical way. Like, what are the technologies, like what are the approaches and questions that would be advanced most by using this technology? And again, this gets back to the idea is that what does the genome editing enable that we couldn't do before? We don't want to apply genome editing techniques or CRISPR when an older technology would have done fine. Like I mentioned this one yesterday, is that you could go through, I'm working with C. elegans now, you could go through and CRISPR all these genes out of C. elegans, but you can also just order the mutant strains from the repository for $7. You don't even need to use CRISPR because the tools are already there for many of these things. And so it's the idea of like using the technology when it's appropriate to ask questions that we really couldn't address before. So just kind of thinking about this is that, does it make sense to put effort? Because again, like now we're thinking this from a scientific standpoint. When you put out an RFA, you're essentially saying, we're going to take some of the money from the investigator-initiated program to dedicate to a topic we think is really important, that we as a program think's more important than what we think the investigators think are important, right? I mean, this technology is great. The R01 should come in with these technologies. And so is it something that really even makes sense for NIH to do? So I think that, we've talked about the advances in genome technology and the gene editing. This is pulled from one of my slides before about this sort of exposome piece. It's really just been happening over the last few years. I think the same thing here is that we've had these advances over the last century, but here we're looking at a major paradigm type change in the speed and the questions that we're able to answer. It's really, really important. I also want to recommend Jennifer Doudna's book, A Crack in Creation. If your non-scientific friends or even scientific friends want to learn more about it, just a very nice book about the sort of, the struggle that the labs went through and kind of working on this technology. So to end our session too, I don't know if this is a statement on how flexible and nimble our programming committee is, or how sometimes you get behind, is a really elegant paper came out several weeks ago from Harris Wang's lab at Columbia that talked about the use of CRISPR to create a recording of activity, a biological tape recorder, essentially. And we thought this would be a great application because the idea is like it's a way of using the CRISPR technology to sense changes in the environment, the surroundings. And so we asked Harris if he could join us. He couldn't make it in person, but he is going to be doing a webinar. And I think this is one of these emerging technologies that shows how CRISPR is the gift that keeps on giving, is that we're seeing these new things come out all the time. And I think it's a great application of how we can sense environmental perturbations and use genome editing approaches to record that. So do we have Harris on the line? So Harris, I think we're going to turn the controls over to you, and you'll have 20 minutes, and we likely won't have any time for questions because we have a discussion period after you won't be here. So is he there? Okay, your slides are up, Harris.